Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the vast wilderness of 1970s Alaska, a respected local baker named Robert Hansen lived a disturbing double life. By day, he served fresh pastries to smiling customers. By night, he hunted women for sport in the remote Alaskan wilderness, using his private plane to transport victims to their deaths. For over a decade, he killed at least 17 women, marking their burial sites with X's on his aviation map, like a twisted trophy collection. Tonight, we dive into the chilling story of the man who would become known as the Butcher Baker. Let's begin. In the vast wilderness of Alaska during the 1970s and early 1980s, a seemingly ordinary baker named Robert Hansen prowled the streets of Anchorage, hiding a darkness that would eventually reveal him as one of America's most ruthless serial killers. By day, he was a respected business owner, operating a successful bakery in downtown Anchorage, known for his delicious pastries and quiet demeanor. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay a predator who would earn the chilling moniker, the Butcher Baker. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in Estherville, Iowa. His early life was marked by struggle and isolation. Growing up with severe acne and a debilitating stutter, Hansen became the target of relentless bullying throughout his childhood and teenage years. These early experiences would later be recognized as contributing factors to his developing psychopathy. He found solace in hunting, spending countless hours in the wilderness, honing skills that would later serve his sinister purposes. In his youth, Hansen worked at his father's bakery, learning the trade that would eventually provide him with the perfect cover for his crimes. But even before moving to Alaska, Hansen showed signs of violent tendencies. In 1960, he served time in prison for burning down a school bus garage in his hometown. After his release, he married his first wife, but the marriage quickly fell apart when he was arrested again for petty theft. Seeking a fresh start, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska in 1967. The frontier state was experiencing an economic boom due to the discovery of oil in Prudhoe Bay, and Anchorage was rapidly growing. Hansen opened a successful bakery on Fifth Avenue and married his second wife, who bore him 2 children. To all outward appearances, he had transformed into a model citizen, a small business owner living the American dream. But Alaska's largest city was changing during this period. The influx of oil money brought not only legitimate businesses, but also a booming illegal sex trade. Prostitutes and dancers flocked to Anchorage, drawn by the promise of quick money from oil workers flush with cash. This created a hunting ground for Hansen, who began to prey on these vulnerable women. His method was calculated and cruel. Hansen would approach women, usually sex workers or dancers, and offer them money for a private encounter. He would then kidnap them at gunpoint, forcing them into his car or his private plane. What followed was a pattern of torture and assault that would later shock even the most hardened investigators. Hansen owned a Piper Super Cub, a small bush plane common in Alaska, which he used to transport his victims to remote cabins in the wilderness. There, he would sexually assault them before releasing them into the wild, giving them a head start before hunting them down with his hunting rifle, like animals for sport. This horrifying game satisfied both his need for dominance and his hunting instincts. For years, Hansen's crimes went undetected. The transient nature of many of his victims meant their disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated. Those who did survive his attacks were often too frightened to come forward, or when they did, their stories were dismissed due to their involvement in the sex trade. The vast Alaskan wilderness also proved to be the perfect accomplice, swallowing up evidence and bodies in its immense expanse. The turning point came in June 1983, when a young sex worker named Cindy Paulson escaped from Hansen. She had been handcuffed, tortured, and raped in Hansen's home, but managed to flee while he was loading his plane, running barefoot through the streets of Anchorage until she flagged down a passing truck driver. Her detailed testimony would prove crucial in bringing Hansen to justice. Initially, Hansen nearly escaped justice again. He was a respected business owner, and Paulson was a sex worker with a criminal record. Many were inclined to believe Hansen's story that Paulson was trying to extort money from him. However, Sergeant Glenn Floth of the Alaska State Troopers wasn't convinced by Hansen's denials. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Hansen had a 1972 conviction for assault with a deadly weapon, having attempted to rape a house cleaner at gunpoint. This revelation prompted a more thorough investigation of Hansen's activities. Flother brought in FBI Special Agent John Douglas, a pioneer in criminal profiling, to analyze the case. Douglas's profile of the killer was remarkably accurate. He suggested they were looking for an experienced hunter who would be familiar with the Alaskan wilderness, someone who lived a seemingly normal life, but harbored deep-seated resentment toward women, particularly those involved in the sex trade. The profile fit Hansen perfectly. The investigation intensified when police began mapping the locations where bodies had been discovered in the Alaskan wilderness. A pattern emerged. Many of the sites were accessible only by plane, and they all fell within flying distance of Anchorage. When overlaid with aviation maps, investigators realized the bodies were found near remote airstrips where a small plane could land. In October 1983, investigators obtained a warrant to search Hansen's home, plane, and vehicles. What they found was damning: jewelry and personal items belonging to missing women, an aviation map marked with dozens of X's corresponding to where bodies had been found, and a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 rifle that would later be matched to several murder victims. Faced with mounting evidence, Robert Hansen finally broke down during interrogation. In a chilling series of interviews with investigators, he confessed to murdering 17 women and raping another 30 over the span of 12 years. He agreed to lead investigators to the burial sites of his victims, though many bodies would never be recovered due to Alaska's unforgiving terrain and the passage of time. Hansen's confessions revealed the horrifying details of his methodology. He maintained detailed records of his victims and their burial locations, marking them with X's on his aviation map like macabre trophies. He specifically targeted sex workers and exotic dancers because, as he coldly explained to investigators, he believed they would not be missed and that police would be less likely to investigate their disappearances thoroughly. The killer's description of his crimes was delivered with an unsettling detachment. He explained how he would offer women money for private photo shoots or propose to fly them to his remote cabin for a champagne picnic. Once they were in his control, he would pull out his hunting knife or gun. Some victims were taken to his house on Old Harbor Road, where he had a secret room in the basement. There, he would torture and rape them before forcing them onto his plane for the final, fatal hunt. One of Hansen's victims, Paula Goulding, had been found in 1983 near Knik River. During his confession, Hansen revealed that he had taken particular pleasure in hunting her, describing how he had given her a head start before tracking her through the wilderness. Her remains, like those of many others, showed evidence of both knife wounds and gunshots from a .223 caliber rifle. The story of Joanna Messina, another victim whose body was recovered, highlighted the calculated nature of Hansen's crimes. He had met her at the Wild Cherry Bar where she worked as a dancer. After kidnapping her, he flew her to his remote cabin, where he raped and tortured her before releasing her into the wilderness. He later told investigators that he had enjoyed tracking her through the snow before finally killing her with his hunting rifle. In February 1984, Hansen agreed to a plea deal. He pled guilty to 4 murders, those of Paula Goulding, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Andrea Altieri. In exchange for the plea and his help in locating his victims' bodies, prosecutors agreed not to charge him with any additional murders. He was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole, plus a life sentence. The investigation had uncovered a total of 17 known victims, though investigators suspected the true number might be higher. Of these, Hansen provided information leading to the recovery of 12 bodies. The remaining victims have never been found, their bodies likely lost forever in the vast Alaskan wilderness. During his imprisonment, Hansen revealed more about his motivations. He spoke of his troubled childhood, his stutter, and his feelings of inadequacy around women. He described how his hunting prowess had given him a sense of power he had never experienced in normal social interactions. The remote Alaskan landscape had provided him with both opportunity and concealment for his crimes. The case led to significant changes in how law enforcement handled missing persons cases, particularly those involving sex workers and other vulnerable populations. The dismissive attitude that had allowed Hansen to operate undetected for so long was recognized as a serious failure of the justice system. Sergeant Glenn Floth, who had been instrumental in catching Hansen, later reflected on the case. What made Hansen especially dangerous was his ability to maintain such a normal facade. He was a successful businessman, a family man, and an accomplished hunter. Nobody suspected that the quiet baker with the stutter was actually a ruthless predator. The impact of Hansen's crimes on the Anchorage community was profound. The case exposed the vulnerabilities of women working in the sex industry and highlighted the dangers they faced. It also revealed how the rapid growth and transient nature of Alaska's population during the oil boom had created perfect conditions for a serial killer to operate undetected. The story of the butcher-baker became deeply embedded in Alaskan culture, a dark chapter in the state's history that served as a reminder of how the same wilderness that attracted people seeking adventure and opportunity could also harbor unspeakable evil. The vast expanses that made Alaska famous also made it an ideal hunting ground for a predator like Hansen. In the years following his conviction, several books and documentaries were produced about the case. John Douglas, the FBI profiler who had helped catch Hansen, included the case in his book Mindhunter, using it as an example of how criminal profiling could help solve complex cases. The case has since become a significant study in criminal psychology, particularly regarding organized killers who maintain seemingly normal lives while conducting their crimes. Robert Hansen died on August 21, 2014, at Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage at the age of 75. He had been transferred there from Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward due to undisclosed health conditions. His death marked the end of one of Alaska's darkest chapters, but the impact of his crimes continues to resonate through the criminal justice system and the communities he terrorized. The wilderness areas where Hansen hunted his victims remain largely unchanged. The remote airstrips he used still serve bush pilots, and the dense forests still hide their secrets. For many Alaskans, these places serve as silent memorials to the women who lost their lives there, victims of a man who turned his hunting skills to the most terrible purpose imaginable. The investigation and conviction of Robert Hansen also shed light on the crucial role of forensic evidence in solving serial murder cases. The ballistics analysis of Hansen's .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 rifle proved particularly significant. Forensic experts were able to match striations on recovered bullets from several victims to Hansen's weapon, providing irrefutable physical evidence linking him to the murders. The items recovered from Hansen's home told their own horrifying story. Among his trophies were pieces of jewelry and personal effects belonging to his victims, each carefully stored away like macabre souvenirs. One particularly disturbing find was a gold chain that belonged to Joanna Messina, which Hansen had kept hidden in his basement. These items would later be returned to the victims' families, providing some small measure of closure. The aviation map found in Hansen's possession became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Each X marked on the map represented a victim's burial site, and Hansen had annotated some locations with small notes and numbers. This methodical record-keeping revealed the organized nature of his crimes and helped investigators understand the full scope of his activities. The map also helped them locate several previously undiscovered victims. During his lengthy confessions, Hansen provided disturbing insights into his selection process for victims. He specifically chose women who were new to Alaska or who appeared to be transient, believing their disappearances would be less likely to raise alarms. He explained to investigators how he would observe potential victims for days, learning their routines and identifying vulnerabilities he could exploit. One of the most chilling aspects of Hansen's methodology was his use of a scanner to monitor police frequencies. He would listen to police communications while hunting his victims, allowing him to avoid areas where law enforcement was active. This level of preparation and awareness helped him evade detection for over a decade. The story of Lisa Futrell, one of Hansen's confirmed victims, particularly illustrated the predator's patient and calculating nature. Futrell, a 41-year-old dancer, had been approached by Hansen multiple times at her workplace before he finally abducted her. Her body was found near the Nick River, and Hansen later described in detail how he had spent weeks planning her abduction, studying her schedule and habits. The role of Cindy Paulson, the woman who escaped and ultimately helped bring Hansen to justice, cannot be overstated. Her courage in coming forward, despite the initial skepticism she faced, was crucial to breaking the case. In later interviews, Paulson described how she had managed to escape while Hansen was distracted loading his plane. She had run barefoot through the streets of Anchorage, still wearing handcuffs, desperate to find help. Detective Flo's handling of Paulson's case marked a significant departure from how such reports had been treated in the past. Unlike previous investigators who had dismissed similar claims from sex workers, Flo took Paulson's story seriously and provided her with protection. This change in approach proved crucial not only for solving Hansen's crimes, but also for establishing better protocols for handling similar cases in the future. The psychological evaluation of Hansen after his arrest revealed a complex and disturbing personality. Psychiatrists noted his ability to compartmentalize his life, maintaining a clear separation between his public persona as a respectable businessman and his secret life as a predator. This ability to switch between these two personas had allowed him to maintain his double life for so long. Hansen's wife and children were devastated by the revelations of his crimes. They had been completely unaware of his activities, though his wife later recalled periods when he would be gone for hours or days, supposedly on hunting trips. The impact on his family was profound, and they eventually left Alaska, trying to escape the shadow of his crimes. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of Alaska's indigenous women, who had long been targets of violence with little attention from law enforcement. Several of Hansen's victims were Alaska Native women, and their cases had initially received minimal investigation. This pattern of neglect would later become a focal point for activists working to address violence against Indigenous women. The search for Hansen's remaining victims continues to this day. Some families still hope for closure, waiting for remains to be discovered in the vast Alaskan wilderness. Advances in DNA technology have allowed investigators to re-examine evidence from the case, though the harsh Alaskan environment has made preservation of genetic material difficult. The lessons learned from the Hansen case led to significant changes in law enforcement procedures, particularly in how missing persons cases involving sex workers are handled. The case demonstrated the importance of taking all disappearances seriously, regardless of the victim's background or lifestyle. It also highlighted the need for better coordination between different law enforcement agencies, especially in cases involving vast geographical areas. The impact of Hansen's crimes extended beyond Alaska. His case became a valuable study for law enforcement agencies worldwide, particularly in understanding how serial killers can operate in remote areas while maintaining seemingly normal lives. The case is still taught at the FBI Academy as an example of successful criminal profiling and the importance of taking all missing persons reports seriously. The investigation of Robert Hansen's crimes also led to important advances in the way law enforcement handles cases involving missing sex workers and exotic dancers. In the years following his conviction, police departments across the country began implementing new protocols for investigating disappearances of individuals involved in the sex industry, acknowledging that their vulnerable status often made them targets for violent predators. The testimony of the surviving victims provided crucial insights into Hansen's behavior and methodology. One survivor, who had managed to escape before being taken to his plane, described how Hansen's demeanor would change completely once he had control over his victims. The quiet, stuttering baker would transform into a cold, calculating predator who seemed to take pleasure in his victims' terror. The search and recovery efforts in the Alaskan wilderness proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the case. Even with Hansen's cooperation and the marked map, many sites were nearly impossible to reach. The terrain, weather conditions, and wildlife had erased much of the evidence over the years. Some search areas were so remote that they could only be accessed by helicopter, and teams had to contend with dense undergrowth, boggy ground, and the ever-present danger of bears. The investigation revealed that Hansen had constructed a sophisticated system of caches throughout the wilderness, containing supplies and equipment he used during his hunts. These hidden stockpiles included ammunition, food, and basic survival gear, indicating the level of planning that went into his crimes. Some of these caches were found to contain personal items belonging to his victims, which he had kept as trophies. One of the most disturbing aspects of Hansen's crimes was his use of his bush pilot skills. He had obtained his pilot's license in 1967, shortly after moving to Alaska, and had logged thousands of hours flying over the region's challenging terrain. This expertise allowed him to access extremely remote areas and gave him intimate knowledge of the wilderness where he would later hunt his victims. The psychological impact on the investigators who worked the case was significant. Detective Floth later spoke about the emotional toll of listening to Hansen's matter-of-fact descriptions of his crimes. The killer would often describe the murders with the same detached tone he might use to discuss baking techniques, showing no remorse or emotional connection to his actions. During his imprisonment, Hansen rarely spoke about his crimes, but when he did, he maintained the same disconnected attitude. In one notable interview in the 1990s, he attempted to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, claiming that his childhood experiences and social rejection had driven him to violence. Mental health professionals who evaluated him noted that this self-pitying narrative was typical of organized serial killers who seek to rationalize their actions. The case also drew attention to the broader issue of violence against women in Alaska. The state has long had one of the highest rates of sexual assault and murder of women in the nation, a problem that persists to this day. Hansen's crimes, while extreme, were part of a larger pattern of violence that was often overlooked or minimized by authorities. The recovery of victim Sherry Morrow's body in 1984 provided investigators with crucial forensic evidence that would help piece together Hansen's murder methodology. Her remains showed signs of both knife wounds and gunshots, consistent with Hansen's pattern of torturing his victims before hunting them. The forensic analysis of her remains helped establish a timeline for her murder and provided valuable evidence for the prosecution. In the decades following Hansen's conviction, several cold cases from the 1970s and early 1980s were re-examined for possible connections to his crimes. While he had confessed to 17 murders, investigators suspected there might be more victims. The transient nature of many of the women who passed through Anchorage during the oil boom years made it difficult to establish a complete victim count. The Hansen case also highlighted the importance of maintaining detailed missing persons databases. Many of his victims had never been reported missing, or their disappearances had been poorly documented. This led to reforms in how law enforcement agencies track missing persons cases, particularly those involving vulnerable populations. The bakery that Hansen had operated became a symbol of his double life. After his arrest, the business was sold, but it struggled to overcome its association with the butcher-baker. The building still stands in downtown Anchorage, though it has housed several different businesses since then. Local residents still point it out to visitors, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. The lasting impact of the Hansen case continues to influence criminal investigations and social policies in Alaska and beyond. The state has implemented numerous reforms in how law enforcement handles cases involving vulnerable populations, particularly Indigenous women and those involved in the sex industry. These changes include mandatory training for officers on handling sensitive cases and improved coordination between different jurisdictions. The physical evidence collected during the Hansen investigation remains stored in the Alaska State Troopers' evidence facility. Some items, including Hansen's infamous aviation map and the Ruger Mini 14 rifle, have become important teaching tools for law enforcement training. The map, in particular, serves as a stark reminder of how methodically Hansen approached his crimes, with each X representing a life brutally taken. In 2020, advances in DNA technology led investigators to re-examine some of the unidentified remains found in areas where Hansen was known to have operated. While these efforts haven't yet led to new identifications, the work continues, driven by the hope of providing closure to families who still wonder if their missing loved ones might have been among Hansen's victims. The areas where Hansen committed his crimes have changed little over the decades. The Nick River area, where several victims were found, remains a popular destination for outdoor enthusiasts, though many visitors are unaware of its dark history. Local guides sometimes point out the locations of former airstrips that Hansen used, now mostly reclaimed by nature. Some of the survivors of Hansen's attacks have become advocates for victims' rights and reforms in the justice system. Their testimonies about how their initial reports were dismissed have helped shape new policies for handling assault allegations, particularly those made by individuals involved in the sex industry. The case has also become an important part of criminal justice education. FBI trainees at Quantico study the Hansen investigation as an example of how criminal profiling, forensic evidence, and traditional detective work can come together to solve complex cases. The case is particularly noted for demonstrating how seemingly upstanding citizens can lead double lives as predators. Former Detective Glenn Floth, now retired, occasionally gives lectures about the case to law enforcement groups. He emphasizes how crucial it was to listen to and believe Cindy Paulson, noting that if earlier reports from other women had been taken seriously, some lives might have been saved. His experiences with the case have made him a strong advocate for better treatment of sexual assault victims by law enforcement. The Hansen case also led to changes in aviation regulations in Alaska. While bush pilots still enjoy considerable freedom, there are now stricter reporting requirements for flights to remote areas. These changes were implemented partly in response to how Hansen had used his pilot's license to facilitate his crimes. In the years since Hansen's death in 2014, several documentaries and books have explored different aspects of his crimes. These works have helped maintain public awareness about the case and its implications for law enforcement and society. They've also served to memorialize the victims, ensuring their stories aren't forgotten. The legacy of the Butcher Baker case continues to influence how Alaska deals with violence against women. The state has implemented numerous programs aimed at protecting vulnerable populations, including improved emergency response systems and better support services for assault survivors. However, the challenges of policing vast remote areas remain, and Alaska continues to grapple with high rates of violence against women. Today, the case serves as a sobering reminder of how societal prejudices and institutional indifference can enable predators to operate undetected. The lessons learned from the Hansen investigation continue to shape law enforcement practices and public policy, particularly regarding the protection of vulnerable populations and the investigation of missing persons cases. The story of Robert Hansen, the Butcher Baker, remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Alaska's history, but it's also a story of how dedicated law enforcement work, advances in forensic science, and the courage of survivors can ultimately bring even the most calculating predators to justice.